She heard his voice through the supply room door, and she stopped. It was a tone she recognized, the way you recognize a road sign after you have already passed the turn. Casual, a little tired, the way Dr. Marsh spoke when he was wrapping up a conversation he had already decided. She had transcribed 100 consultations in that register. The word he used was non-clinical. The word after that was behavioral. Then he said a name, and the name was hers. She did not push the door open. She did not say anything. She stood in the corridor with her coat over her arm and her bag at her shoulder, and 7 months of appointments arranged themselves in a row inside her chest, and not one of them changed. 7 months ago, she had sat in Welland Private Clinic's reception area for the first time with a folder of printed test results, 2 referral letters she had requested herself, and a particular kind of hope she had since learned to ration carefully. The folder had a small tear along the bottom spine. She had not had time to replace it. Welland looked, from its waiting room, exactly as private medicine was supposed to look. The chairs were upholstered in a pale oatmeal fabric, firm at the armrests, the kind that holds its shape against whatever is brought to it. The artwork was not a print, a small oil painting, something coastal and green, a ledge of pale rock above calm water, the sort of image chosen to confirm that real things had been spent and that the spending was tasteful. The water in the dispenser was filtered. Nora had saved for the initial consultation fee across 2 billing cycles, not because she could not technically afford it, but because she had learned to be careful after the year her largest transcription contract had ended without warning. She had brought the folder because she was thorough. She had brought the referral letters because she had learned from the appointment before this one, at a different practice, that arriving without documentation was not arriving at all. The receptionist that morning had been Helen Yates, and Helen had looked at her the way a person looks at another person. It was not a complicated thing to do, and Nora had noticed it, because it was not the room's default. Dr. Marsh had seen her for 18 minutes on that first appointment. He had reviewed 3 months of her symptom log, which she had prepared in a format she knew would be easy to read, because she spent her working days making complex medical language navigable for other people. He had told her that chronic fatigue in women presenting without inflammatory markers frequently resolved with lifestyle adjustment. He had used the words occupational stress in a tone that suggested her job was the problem, and not the symptoms she had reported while working hours considerably lighter than his own. Midway through his summary, he had turned to his monitor and entered something while he continued speaking, and Nora had understood from that angle, his shoulders, the pause before the keystroke, that whatever he was recording had not required a second look at her symptom log. He had scheduled a follow-up. She had attended that follow-up and 5 more after it, across 7 months. Each appointment had produced the same essential answer in slightly different phrasing. The symptom log she maintained had grown to 46 weeks of entries. It was organized by date, by category, and by severity on a scale she had constructed herself, because no one had offered her one. On the morning David Chambers arrived at Welland, she did not know who he was. He came in carrying a laptop bag and a folder from the medical rotation coordinator, and he introduced himself to Helen as Daniel Carr. He was placed at a spare workstation in the consultation support office, a room that contained 2 desks, a filing system from the previous decade, and a window that looked out at the side of the building next door. The office smelled of old paper and the cleaning product the building used on its back corridor floors. The window admitted a band of morning light so narrow it reached neither desk, landing instead on the wall between them in a pale stripe that shortened as the morning advanced. Helen gave him the building orientation she gave every rotating apprentice, which took 14 minutes, and she noted afterward that he had listened to all of it without checking his phone once. She had taken that as either a good sign or a very practiced performance, and she had not yet determined which. Marsh had glanced at him once and returned to his notes. Rotation apprentices came through a coordinator arrangement Marsh found procedurally necessary and personally minor. He did not alter the day's schedule. That morning, Nora had her 7th appointment. She had come this time with a specific request. She had researched the imaging protocols for chronic fatigue and joint pain presentations over the preceding 3 weeks, using the same medical databases she accessed for transcription work. She understood the request was reasonable. She also understood from 6 prior appointments that reasonable requests had a particular status at Welland that depended less on their reasonableness than on who was making them. She asked Dr. Marsh whether an imaging order would be appropriate given the duration and pattern of her symptoms. He said the imaging would not change his clinical picture at this stage. She asked whether the imaging might rule out structural causes. He said that the profile of her symptoms did not suggest structural involvement. There was a version of herself that would have argued. She had practiced that version quietly in the car on the way to appointments, and she had stopped practicing it sometime around the 3rd appointment, when she had understood that arguing with Dr. Marsh produced the same answers, delivered in a slower, more patient tone that was somehow worse. She thanked him and gathered her folder and stood. In the consultation corridor outside, she held the folder against her chest for exactly 1 breath, then released her grip to something more ordinary, and walked toward the reception area. The overhead lights ran a flat, even white along the length of the corridor, the kind of light that gives everything the same value and asks nothing of what it falls on. The floor tiles were pale and said nothing back. She did not know anyone was watching. He was standing in the doorway of the support office, the laptop bag still on his shoulder, and he had been close enough to the corridor to hear the exchange. Not every word, but the register of it. And the register was enough. He watched her walk the length of the hallway and reach the reception desk and say something brief and ordinary to Helen. And then she took a seat in the waiting area and opened her phone. And the particular way she sat down was the thing he kept returning to later. Not collapsed, not performing composure. Something more like someone who had been practicing the distance between what happened and how they carried it for long enough that the distance no longer required effort. He did not introduce himself that day. An hour later, she was still in the waiting area. This was not unusual for her. She stayed occasionally after appointments because the waiting room was warmer than the bus stop, and because there was a chair in the far corner with better lumbar support than the one in her home office, where she spent most of her working day. On this particular afternoon, the reason she stayed was a woman named Margaret, who was 81 years old and had arrived late for her appointment and been told she would need to wait to be rescheduled, and who had sat down in the chair next to Nora's and said nothing for 4 minutes before she began, quietly, to cry. Nora had not asked what was wrong. She had simply stayed. She had not checked her phone after the first minute. She had asked at some point whether Margaret would like some water, and Margaret had said no, and then had said yes, please, and Nora had gotten it and returned and sat back down without making anything of it. They had spoken a little, not about the appointment, not about whatever had brought Margaret to tears, but about the journey in and the buses and the kind of conversation that is less about information than about the sound of another voice. Helen, at the front desk, moved twice between her chair and the filing cabinet behind it during those 38 minutes. Straightening folders that did not need straightening, her gaze directed carefully away from the far corner with the precision of someone who understood that witnessing and making an occasion of witnessing were not the same act. Margaret's daughter arrived 38 minutes later, apologizing, and Margaret stood and straightened her coat and nodded at Nora with a precise, dignified nod that meant more than the words she chose, which was simply, "You were kind." Nora missed her bus. She sat for another 15 minutes waiting for the next one. She did not know that she had been watched for most of those 38 minutes from the small window in the support office door. She had no reason to look for an audience. There had not been one. The first time they spoke was the following day. She had come in to collect a clinical summary request she had submitted the week before, and he was at the front desk when she arrived, returning a set of files to Helen's side of the counter. Helen introduced them with the mild efficiency she used for everyone, and they exchanged the brief, neutral words that two people exchange when they occupy the same institutional space without shared function. His name registered as a name and nothing more. She had several hundred contacts in the medical transcription system, and she moved through introductions the way she moved through most things at Welland, competently and without expectation. He handed her the form before Helen could reach it. Not conspicuously. He had simply seen her looking for it, and it had been closer to him than to Helen, and he had passed it across. Their hands did not touch. The exchange took less than 2 seconds. She said thank you, and he said of course, and that was the first conversation. It was not on its face a thing worth noting. The clinic was full of small transactional courtesies. What separated this one from the others was something Nora did not identify as significant at the time, something she understood only later as the difference between a courtesy performed for a room and a courtesy offered to a person. He had not looked past her while he handed it over. He had looked at her. For the half-second that the form moved from his hand to hers, his attention had been on her specifically, and not on the next item on any list. She filed it as a small kindness and moved on. The second encounter happened near the end of the first week. Marsh had asked her to wait in consultation room 3 while he reviewed something from her previous visit, a request that was itself an unusual departure from his pattern, and she had settled in the chair across from the empty desk and opened her notes. The room had one window, set high in the wall and looking onto an interior courtyard, a small square of pavement, a single tree that had lost all its leaves, a rectangle of grey winter sky above. The light it let in was thin and lateral, and fell across the desk at an angle that showed the age of the surface, the pale scratches left by years of folders and pens set down without thought. Daniel Carr had come in to drop a set of printed lab routing forms on the desk, and found her there, and the polite thing to do had been to apologize and withdraw, which he had done. And then she had said there was no need. He could leave the forms, and he had set them down. And for a reason neither of them fully addressed, he had stayed a moment longer than the forms required. He had looked at the symptom log she was holding, not intrusively, and not for long. He had looked at it the way someone looks at a document when they recognize its structure, and she had noticed the recognition. She had said, "Medical background?" he had said, "Some." The file folder at the edge of the desk had shifted slightly as he set down the forms, and it had started to slide. They had both reached for it at the same moment. They had both stopped. The folder had not fallen. Their hands were an inch apart on the desk, and then he had withdrawn his, and she had taken the folder and set it flat, and neither of them had mentioned it. "I should let you wait in peace," he said. She nodded, and he left. She sat with the held stillness of it for 2 or 3 seconds, then returned to her notes. The third encounter came in the middle of the second week, on a Tuesday afternoon when the waiting room had emptied of everyone except the two of them. Nora had stayed to wait for a prescription correction Helen had said would be ready by 4. It was 3:30 and Helen had gone to chase it down, leaving her reading glasses folded at the edge of the reception desk and a pen laid across her notepad as though she intended to return to a specific word. The room had the particular quality of an empty waiting room in winter, which is less like quiet and more like a pause. The radiator along the near wall ticked twice and went still. Through the front windows, the afternoon had gone to a flat grey that made the oatmeal-coloured chairs look tired. She had been reading a journal article on autoimmune diagnostic timelines that she had downloaded the week before, annotating the margins in small, neat letters, because she had stopped carrying a separate notebook for this purpose. He had been waiting too for something unspecified he had not mentioned, and they had existed in the same room without speaking for several minutes before she asked him, without particular intent, whether he found the rotation useful. He said it was more useful than he had expected. She asked what he had expected. He said, "A lot of forms." She almost smiled. She recognized the precise register of understatement from nowhere. Not from the clinic, not from anyone she had spoken to in 7 months of appointments. And she almost smiled, and she did not, and the almost had been its own small thing. They talked for the remaining 20 minutes, and what they talked about was nothing that should have mattered. The walk from the bus stop, the quality of the clinic's printer paper, a question she had about a medical scheduling system she recognized from a transcription client's files. Ordinary things. Things that two people say when the clinical hierarchy of a building has briefly released them from its sorting requirements. She had not looked up. The warmth of the room, the particular weight of his stillness beside her, the pull of someone's attention offered without agenda. She had attributed it to the relief of ordinary company in a building that had been treating her as a file number for 7 months. She had attributed it to gratitude. She had attributed it to a great many things that were accurate, and she had not attributed it to what she had not yet allowed herself to name. Helen had returned with the corrected prescription and handed it to Nora with a look that said Helen had noticed the room and the conversation and was choosing not to make an occasion of it. Nora thanked her and left. 2 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, she was walking past the supply room corridor on the way to collect an insurance form from the back office when she heard Dr. Marsh's voice through the door. He was speaking to someone she could not identify, a colleague, a voice she did not recognize, and he was speaking in the register she knew from every appointment. Calm, practical, already finished. "Hail," he said. 7 months, no acute presentation. I'll close the file as non-clinical at the end of the month. A murmur from the other voice. "There's a behavioral health referral line she can be directed to," Marsh said. "It's the appropriate channel." She stood there for a moment. She would not afterward be able to measure. The insurance form was still in the back office, still in a tray she had not reached. She was aware in the secondary and useless way of a person who has just stopped moving, of the corridor's strip light running its low, even hum above her, and the smell of the floor product, and a phone ringing once at the front desk, and falling silent. 7 months of appointments arranged themselves in a single row, and she walked the length of them, each one. The folder with the tear at the spine, the symptom log now 47 weeks long, the 11 printed articles annotated in the margins, the 6 conversations in which she had asked variations of the same careful question and accepted variations of the same careful non-answer, because she had been told she was in the right place, and she had believed it. She had believed it. The voice behind the door said something about end-of-month paperwork. Marsh said yes, that would do. Nora turned and walked back the way she had come. She walked back the way she had come, and the clinic continued around her in its ordinary registers. A phone ringing at the front desk, the soft percussion of a door in the consultation wing, Helen's voice somewhere near the printer saying something unhurried to a patient. None of it changed. That was the thing she was still absorbing as she collected the insurance form from the back office and signed where she was meant to sign and slid the form across the counter. The world of the building had not shifted by a single angle. Only she had. She sat in her car for 11 minutes before she started the engine. She had known, on some quiet and protected level, that Marsh was not looking for anything in her file anymore. She had known it the way you know that a door is locked before you try the handle, from the particular quality of all the occasions you have tried it, and found it exactly the same. What she had not known was that there was an end-of-month deadline, a behavioral health line, a plan already made that had not required her presence or her consent. The appointment had never been a conversation. She understood that now, without room for revision. She drove home and worked for 3 hours on a cardiology transcription she had been halfway through since morning. The work was precise and requiring, and she was good at it. And for 3 hours, the precision of it was the only room she needed to be in. That evening, she made a cup of tea and did not drink it. She sat at her kitchen table. She had cleared this table each of the past 7 months to spread out test results and printed articles and the log itself, making the same clean rectangle of space for the same unfinished problem. With her symptom log open in front of her, 47 weeks of it, the dates and the categories and the severity scale she had constructed herself, and she read through the last 3 months of entries as though reviewing someone else's file. She was not being dramatic. She had always been wary of drama, wary of the version of herself that would have stood in the supply corridor and wept or walked back into Marsh's office and demanded a different answer. What she was doing, alone at the table with the cold tea and the 47 weeks, was something more like accounting. The kitchen was dark except for the lamp above the table, a small cone of yellow light that turned the symptom log's printed pages a shade closer to cream. She was locating the gap between what she had believed and what had been true, and she was doing it carefully because she was going to need an accurate measurement. She had 7 months of documented symptoms. She had a working knowledge of the imaging protocols relevant to her presentation. She had read 11 journal articles on diagnostic timelines for autoimmune and chronic fatigue presentations in the preceding 5 weeks, and she had annotated every one of them. And she was not a physician, but she was not confused, and she was not willing to be directed to a behavioral health line and told that was the appropriate channel. She thought about who in the building she could ask. She worked through it the way she worked through a difficult transcription passage, carefully, without rushing, letting the honest answer surface. The consultant physicians rotated on a schedule she had no access to. Marsh was the clinical director, and his name was on her file. The administrative staff were kind, but had no clinical authority. She could request a patient advocate and wait, and by the time the request moved through the appropriate channels, the end of the month would have arrived first. She thought about Daniel Carr. She thought about the form he had handed across without being asked, and the file folder he had stopped from falling, and the way he had listened in the waiting room without filling. The silences with reassurance she had not requested. She thought about the 2 or 3 seconds in consultation room 3 when he had looked at her symptom log, and she had asked if he had a medical background, and he had said some. And she had believed him, even though the answer had told her almost nothing. He was not a physician. He was a first-year apprentice on a rotation placement, and he had no more clinical authority than Helen did, and she understood this. She was not looking for authority. She was looking for someone who would take the note to the right desk. She wrote it the next morning, at her kitchen table before she opened the transcription files. The morning light came through the window above the sink in a flat grey that suggested cloud cover without confirming it. She used a black pen she kept in the front pocket of her bag and a sheet of plain white printer paper from the stack beside her work printer. She did not perform it. She did not write the version that argued or explained or laid out the 11 articles and the 47 weeks. She wrote a plain request, that any physician on staff willing to review her imaging history as a second opinion would please let her know through the front desk at their convenience, and that she would supply whatever documentation was needed. 6 sentences. She signed it with her full name and the date and the file number she had memorized from her appointment correspondence. She folded it in thirds and wrote his name on the outside, Daniel. Not a last name because she did not know his last name with certainty, and not because she had decided to be informal, but because the note was not for a system. It was for a person. She arrived at Welland the following morning on the 9 o'clock bus. The front entrance was cold in the way of buildings whose heat had not fully caught up with the morning, and the corridor's overhead lights were still carrying their early-hour flatness when she pushed through the door. He was in the main corridor, standing near the consultation wing door, with a set of routing files under his arm, reviewing something on his clipboard. He looked up when the door opened, the way people look up in corridors from habit, and then he looked at her more specifically, in the way he had been doing across 2 weeks of encounters that she had been cataloguing under words like attentive and present and attributed to temperament. She crossed the corridor and took the note from her bag and held it out. "I wondered if you might be able to pass this to someone who could help," she said. "A physician on staff, any physician. I'm not asking for anything outside the normal process." She paused. "I just don't have a better way to ask." He took the note. He looked at the folded paper in his hand, at his name on the outside, and then he looked at her. "I'll see what I can do," he said. She nodded and went to find Helen about the appointment rescheduling she had come in to handle. And she did not look back. She carried the relief of having done what she could do as far as it would take her, which was not very far, and she knew that, and she walked with it anyway. Helen was at her desk when Nora reached the counter, a stack of patient intake forms beside her keyboard that she was working through one at a time, pulling a page, reviewing it, setting it in a second stack with the particular efficiency of someone who had done this particular task many hundreds of times. They spoke briefly about the rescheduling, and Helen opened the calendar window on her screen and clicked through 2 months of appointment slots with the eraser end of her pencil, and they settled on a date, and Helen printed the confirmation and slid it across. Nora thanked her, folded it into her bag, and took the corner chair to wait for the next step. The financial administrator arrived at 11:15. Her name was Sandra Keel, and she worked in the administrative offices of the holding trust that provided Welland's operational funding, and she had been to the clinic twice before in the 4 years of the arrangement, both times for the same purpose. She handed Helen her identification and explained that she needed the patron's signature on a quarterly trust document, and that she had been advised he was currently in residence. Helen looked up from her desk and was still for a moment, one hand resting on the identification card before she said she would locate him. Sandra Keel said she understood it might be an inconvenient time, but the document required an in-person signature by the end of the business day, and she had come as early as the morning allowed. Nora was in the waiting area at the time, seated in the far corner chair, filling out a rescheduling form on a clipboard. She had heard the exchange from across the room, the way you hear things in a quiet space without listening for them, and the word patron had registered without connecting to anything. She returned to the form. Marsh was in the main corridor when Helen came to find him, standing near the consultation wing with a chart in his hand, and Helen said only that someone had come to see Daniel Carr on trust business and needed to know his current location. Marsh looked up from the chart with an expression that indicated he found the interruption minor. He said Daniel was in the support office and could be interrupted. It was a quiet morning. Helen went to the support office door and knocked and said there was someone to see him. He came into the corridor with the clipboard under his arm. Sandra Keel was already there. She had followed Helen from the reception desk because the building was not large, and she had been in it before and she knew the way. She came around the corner from the consultation wing entrance and stopped when she saw him, and she said without hesitation, without any register of the corridor or the other people in it, or any sense that the sentence required a different delivery than the one she gave it. "Mr. Chambers, I have the quarterly document for your signature. I apologize for the inconvenience of the timing." The corridor was quiet for a full 2 seconds. The overhead light ran its even hum. Somewhere in the consultation wing, a door clicked shut. Marsh turned his head. He looked at Daniel Carr the way you look at something when the image your eye has been receiving and the image your brain has been assembling have just produced an inconsistency that neither can resolve. The clipboard, the rotation coordinator folder, the spare workstation, the 14-minute building orientation, 2 weeks of routing forms and consultation support work, a first-year apprentice on a placement, and now a woman from the Trust's administrative offices saying Mr. Chambers with the flat, easy certainty of someone who had said it several hundred times. Daniel Carr did not correct her. He said, "Thank you for coming in, Sandra." And he said it in his own register, not the careful, ordinary register he had been carrying for 2 weeks, and the difference was a sentence's worth of everything. Helen was looking at her desk. She had not moved from her chair, and her hands were in her lap, and she was looking at the surface of the desk with the focused attention of someone reading something that was not there. Nora had put the clipboard down. She was watching through the waiting room's glass panel with the rescheduling form half completed in her lap, and she was watching Marsh watch the man she had known as Daniel Carr stand in the corridor and accept a document satchel from the Trust's financial administrator, and she was watching Marsh's face do something it did not have a practiced expression for. Marsh said, "I wasn't aware." David, because he was David now, looked at him. He did not answer immediately. He set the satchel on the corridor counter and looked at Marsh with the attention of someone who has been watching a particular thing for 2 weeks and has arrived at a sufficient understanding of it. He said, "I know." Marsh said, "The placement coordinator didn't indicate." "No," David said. "It wasn't in the placement paperwork." There was a version of this moment that would have involved a speech, an accounting, a recitation of every appointment and every referral denied, and every 7 months of a symptom log nobody had asked to read. Marsh was standing in the corridor, clearly braced for it, his face arranging itself into the expression of someone waiting to defend a position from the inside. David did not give him the speech. He said, "I'll need a consultation room for a few minutes after the document is signed. There's a specialist referral I'd like to request through the board authority, and a file I'd like to submit for clinical conduct review." He said it the way he said most things, in the smallest sufficient sentence, and he said it with Helen at one end of the corridor and Marsh at the other, and Sandra Keel holding her satchel, and then he looked through the waiting room's glass panel. Nora was still in her chair. She had not moved. She looked at him through the glass, and she did a thing she had not done in 7 months of appointments at Welland, which was to feel the ground level under her feet, and the levelness of it was something she needed a moment to locate. He held her gaze for 1 beat, and then he looked back at Sandra Keel and said he was ready to sign. The afternoon moved through its hours. Nora stayed in the corner chair. She did not try to read. She sat with her bag in her lap and listened to the building return to its ordinary registers. The soft percussion of doors in the consultation wing. A phone at the front desk answered and set down. The sound of the hallway when it is neither busy nor empty. Helen passed through the waiting room once, on the way to the filing cabinet behind the front desk, and on her way back she rested her hand briefly on the corner of the counter nearest to where Nora sat, a small and precise gesture that said what it needed to without requiring a response. And then she returned to her seat and did not make an occasion of it. Helen came to find Nora at 2:30, and told her the specialist referral had been processed through the board that morning and that Nora would receive the scheduling paperwork within 3 business days. She said it in the careful, precise way Helen said things when she meant them completely, and she set a small printed confirmation slip on the corner of the armrest. Nora looked at the slip. The referral had been submitted at 9:47 in the morning. She had given him the note at 9:31. He had already submitted the referral before Sandra Keel had come through the front door, before the corridor, before Marsh's face had done its recalibration in the fluorescent light. He had read the 6 sentences and signed his actual name to the request and sent it through the board authority, and he had done it before there was any consequence attached to doing it, when he was still Daniel Carr to everyone in the building, and could have remained Daniel Carr for as long as the rotation placement ran. She sat with that for a while. Helen also told her, in the same careful voice, that Dr. Marsh's clinical conduct regarding her file had been submitted for formal board review, and that his authority over her case had been transferred pending the review's outcome. She said this without emphasis and without commentary, and what she did not say was anything about the 7 months or the 47 weeks or the 11 annotated articles, because she did not need to. The room already knew. Nora thanked her. Helen said, "It's long overdue," and went back to her desk and sat down and pulled the intake forms toward her again and did not look up. David came to the waiting room at 3:10. He was not carrying the clipboard, and he had left the rotation folder somewhere between the support office and the corridor, and he came through the waiting room door as himself, which was a different quality of presence than the one she had been registering for 2 weeks, without being able to name the source of the difference. He sat down 2 chairs from her and put his hands on his knees and said, "I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." She looked at him. She said, "Why Welland?" He was quiet for a moment in the way he was always quiet, which was not evasive but concentrated. He looked briefly at his hands, then at the pale winter light in the window above the front desk, and then he told her about his sister. Her name was Claire. She had attended a comparable private practice 4 years ago, presenting with symptoms that had been attributed first to anxiety, then to overwork, then to a dietary imbalance for 11 months, and the diagnosis that had finally come had come late enough to change what was possible. He said it plainly, without asking for anything, and he said he had funded Welland after that, not because he believed a charitable trust would correct a pattern that ran through the entire sector, but because he needed to look at a specific building and understand what it was actually doing to the people who walked into it. He said, "I wasn't looking for a patient to observe. I was looking for something I could verify with my own eyes." Nora said, "And?" he said, "And I watched you walk the length of a hallway after a consultation that would have made most people argue and sit with a woman who was crying in a waiting room for 38 minutes and come back 7 months in a row to a building that has not been doing what it should be doing." He stopped. He started again. "I thought what I was seeing was the most accurate thing I had encountered in 4 years of trying to understand what goes wrong in these places." He looked at her directly. "What I found was you, and I wanted you to know that. I wanted it before any of the rest of it." She was quiet. Her hands were in her lap, one resting over the other. The particular weight of being seen, specifically and completely, for the 38 minutes and the 47 weeks, and the hallway walk and all 7 months of appointments, not in spite of them but including them. She sat with it and let it be actual before she decided what to say. She said, "The note." He said, "Yes." She said, "You submitted it before." "Yes." She looked at the confirmation slip on the seat beside her and understood it was the answer to the question she had been asking for 7 months without being able to name it correctly. not whether someone would listen, whether someone would act on what they heard. At 4:15, as the clinic's last appointments concluded, and Helen began the end of day close at the reception desk, pressing the key to log out of the appointment system and drawing a desk drawer shut, David asked if he could call her. Nora was quiet for long enough that Helen stopped typing. She was thinking about the note she had written at her kitchen table and the name she had written on the outside of it, just Daniel, because she had known it was for a person and not a system. She was thinking about what he had said in the waiting room and the word he had used, wanted, plain and undressed, and the fact that he had not reached for something more measured or more defensible. She was thinking about whether what he had felt was real before the name existed, or only afterward, and the question was not an accusation, but a measurement she needed to take before she moved. She said, "Were you watching before the hallway?" He said, "No. I came into the corridor behind the Marsh appointment by chance. After the hallway, yes." And the note. "I would have found a way regardless," he said. The note made it easier. She looked at him for a moment longer. He did not fill the moment. She said, "You can call me." He wrote her number down on the back of a piece of clinic paper, which was the only paper available, and she told it to him without checking her phone because she had memorized it years ago when she had first gone self-employed and needed to be reachable. The clinic paper and the number spoken plainly in the quiet room. That was exactly the register of everything that had come before it. He left at 4:30. She heard the front door close and the small pneumatic pause of it settling back in its frame. She sat for a few minutes after he had gone, in the corner chair, which was a chair she had sat in many times now, and the room was familiar and the light was familiar, and the sound of Helen logging out of the day's system was familiar, and she was inside it differently. Through the front windows, the street had gone grey with early dark, the sodium lamp at the entrance of the car park throwing a pale orange stripe across the nearest section of pavement. She picked up the confirmation slip from the seat beside her and folded it once, cleanly along its centre, and put it in the front pocket of her bag. The specialist appointment came through on the second day of the following week. Helen called at 8 in the morning, and Nora was already at her desk with the transcription files open, and Helen gave her the date and time and the specialist's name, and Nora wrote it down in the symptom log at the bottom of the 47th week's entry in the same small, careful handwriting she had always used. On the morning of the appointment, she walked into Welland through the front entrance at 9 o'clock. The dove-grey walls were the same. The upholstered chairs were the same. The water in the dispenser was filtered, and the artwork was not a print, and the cream-coloured flowers in the vase on the front counter had been replaced, as they were every week, with fresh ones. Helen was at the desk. Helen said, "Good morning, Nora." Nora said, "Good morning." She set her folder on the counter, and the folder had a small tear along the bottom spine, the original one, the same folder she had carried in 7 months ago, because she had not replaced it. She had not needed to.